Following the end of the 7 Years' War, life is good for the people of the British colonists. If you were to look around in 1763, you would say the quality of life in these colonies for the majority of people is better than it is anywhere else in the world. Part of this is a result of the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War and the British victory in the 7 Years' War eliminated the foreign threat to the English colonies. So the French had been up here, but with the defeat of the French in the 7 Years' War, French soldiers would be forced to abandon their forts, pick up, and leave. Again, you're going to still have French civilians, but they're going to be under the authority of British soldiers. British soldiers will place the French in their forts, and they're going to start occupying these French cities, and now no longer are going to have to worry about the French attacking your frontier over here. So, no foreign threat. Spain, it's not much of a threat. Again, the British had taken Florida, so the Spanish no longer have an opportunity to invade Georgia. The Spanish are occupying Louisiana, but the Spanish are incredibly weak at this point. They had been in decline for a substantial period of time, and even though they occupied Louisiana, there's not going to be many Spaniards in Louisiana. It's basically going to be Spain sending up a handful of officials and a handful of soldiers. Most of the population here is just going to remain this French population. And by the way, the French population, a lot of them resents the fact that they're now under Spanish rule. Another Assassin's Creed game's about that if anyone's interested. So now you have Spanish. Sure, they're boarding over here, but there's not even many colonists over here, British colonists over here anyway, and the Spanish don't have much of a chance to invade you because they're weak. Their soldiers are dispersed throughout the Americas. They're a power in decline. So you don't have to worry about a foreign power where you did before 1763. Not only that, Indians are no longer a threat to most British colonists. By 1763, most Indians had been forced west of the Appalachian Mountains, which means that those British citizens living along the coast of North America, which is most of them because this is, access to the ocean, things like that, most British colonists, they probably hadn't seen an Indian attack in generations. Maybe grandpa, or great-great-grandpa remembers the Powhatan attacks, but that was a long time ago. Most British colonists the idea of an Indian threat is foreign to them. Now, you will have some British colonists along the frontier area, and we'll see a handful move beyond the Appalachian Mountains around 1763 and after, but the vast majority of British colonists don't have to worry about Indians. And in areas where there are still Indians, like with these Mississippi cultures, Indians down here, these guys had learned to be friendly. For the most part, they've become Europeanized themselves. They learned that, hey, if we attack the British, they're just going to retaliate with the superior technology, so we're not going to attack them. And so most of these Mississippi culture Indians are not going to be a threat to the British settlers. The only Indians you'd probably say that are still threatening are these Northwest Indians, these variety of Indian groups, these smaller tribes that had gotten used to dealing with the French. They've been getting firearms, weapons from the French. They're going to be upset that the French are now leaving. There'll still be some fur traders coming to visit with them, but they're going to be really upset when the British that come in and refuse now to trade firearms, gunpowder, ammunition to them. And they're going to be a potential threat to the frontier. Same with these Iroquois Indians. They'd like playing the French and British off of one another. They'll be upset. But again, it's just going to be to these frontier settlers. So the vast majority of colonists in these British colonies don't have to worry about getting killed by a foreign power or Indians. This is not something you would see in just about any other part of the world. In Europe, if you're France, you got to worry about Spain or Austria over here. If you're in Africa, you got to worry about this nation over here. You got to worry about slavers from the coast. Asia, there's internal wars going on over there. In British North America, the foreign threat's gone, and most Indians are either knowing how to deal with Europeans and Americans, or they and they're nice. So you don't have to worry about getting killed like you would in most areas of the world. Not only that, but in British North America, things are good for other reasons. In British North America, there's actually a much smaller class divide than in just about anywhere else in the world. If you go to Britain, you're probably one of two classes. You're either the very poor, you were born to a poor family without land, and then you're probably going to die poor because it's very hard to acquire land because there's not a lot of land available. Or you're wealthy, you're born to maybe this 5% that was born into the nobility, maybe has relations to somebody way back in the day that did a favor for a king and earned this land. And if you're born rich, you're probably going to die rich. Now, in Britain, there's a small merchant middle class that has emerged, but it's still a very divided class based society. That's not the case in the colonies. Now, you are going to have an upper class. You will have some people with more property and more wealth than others, but it's not going to be as big a disparity as you'd see in Europe, Africa, Asia, anything like that. So, in the British colonies in 1763, about 10% of the people own about 50% of the wealth. That might sound bad, but you compare that to modern times, and you got probably 10% of the people owning 95% of the wealth these days. It's some people own a lot, and most own very little. That's not the case here in the British colonies. Some own a little bit more, and a lot of this would be the families of the first people that came over and acquired a lot of land for free or for very cheap, something like that, or people that started early industry up here. But it's not a huge class divide. And there's a very good chance in the British colonies that if you are born poor, you can make your way up to the top. There's a couple different reasons for this. One is going to be an availability of land. So, as we've been talking about, with Indians dying of disease, the British forcing them off their land, land is in a surplus when compared to Europe and compared to the Old World. It's very easy to acquire land. Now, as we talked about, it's not as easy as it was in the 1600s, and it's becoming a little bit more scarce. But if you're born into a poor family, you work hard, you maybe work for somebody else for a short period of time, you'll be able to afford your own acreage, work for yourself. And if you work hard enough, you'd probably be able to make enough money to sell goods to somebody else and then work your way to the upper class. Another reason where I can see the class divide is that, as pronounced, is because these colonies are more educated. The people are more educated than anywhere else in the world. You're going to have more people here that can read and write than anywhere else in the world. And specifically, the people in the New England area are going to have an incredibly high literacy rate. Now, we talked about why that's the case up here. You had Puritans coming over. By this point, the ardent Puritanism has died down. It's still some people following Calvinist beliefs, but there's no longer, these harsh laws, at least not as harsh as they were in the early 1600s, based on Puritanism. People had sort of given up the fervent Puritanism by this point, but some of the artifacts that left over were sort of this work ethic and also this focus on education. So what we'd seen up here in New England is, sort of this emphasis on parents to teach their children to read and write. And there'd been public schools established, sometimes at the colony level. So, the general court, it's still running Massachusetts. Maybe they established public schools, or maybe the Colonial Assembly for New York set up some public school system. More often it would be at the local level. So just a town, wherever, here in Connecticut or something, decides we need to educate our children. Let's go ahead and hire Bill, educator, over here, some smart guy, to teach our children. And maybe that's how they got their education. So there's this focus on public education in the colonies more so than anywhere else, and it's actually spread down here to the southern region. So you're going to have not as high literacy rate up here, but a lot of these colonies are going to establish their own public schools. A lot of times it'll just be the wealthy are going to be able to hire tutors for their children. But even still, sort of this pressure of these colonies up here being educated, you will see public schools established down here. Now, as we're going to talk about, slaves, and this is a group that's going to be left out of when we're talking about how fortuitous or fortunate the colonists are. Generally, they won't be taught to read and write. but a decent portion of the white population will be taught to read and write in the South. And even taking the slaves into account, if you took this area and you compared it to anywhere else in the world, the literacy rate's just going to be higher than other places. So again, you might be born poor, but maybe there's a public school where you can learn education, you acquire some land, and then maybe you create a thriving business. Okay, so higher literacy rates than anywhere else. There's also going to be rudimentary industry that's going to offer opportunities for people in these British colonies, and this isn't something you see in other parts of the world. So England and what this or Britain, this is, we'll talk about this a lot. They had begun taking raw products from their colonies like tobacco, turning it into a finished product like a cigar, or taking leather and then turning it into a shoe, or taking wool, turning it into a shirt. And they had sort of taken the lead in manufacturing, taking a raw product, making a finished product out of it. As we're going to talk about, they discouraged their colonies from manufacturing, but in spite of that, you'll see, particularly up here in New England, some manufacturing start, shipbuilding, taking lumber, turning it into a ship, taking sugar from the Caribbean, turning it into rum, and manufacturing in general makes a lot more money than producing raw products. And this is going to offer an opportunity for poorer people to make their way to the upper class, because once this industry begins, you'll start seeing these small scale factories and shops employ people for a wage, and you can actually have the opportunity of earning this wage for a while to maybe start your own shop, buy land. And in other places, including Europe, Asia, Africa, you don't see this industry at this level. Again, it's not going to be anything compared to England, and France is going to have more manufacturing than the colonies in the 1700s, but it is a different type of economy that you wouldn't have anywhere else in the world. Okay, so you're also going to see in these colonies less persecution than you will have in just about anywhere else in the world. Obviously, this is going to exclude slaves in the South, okay? Basically, by this point, the southern colonies and a good chunk of northern colonies as well had put in place laws that saying it is legal to hold Africans as slaves and use them as property, treat them as property, and treat the children, their children, as properties as well. If you're born into slavery in the British colonies, in some ways, it's actually going to be worse than other areas of the world. If you're born a slave in a British colony, let's say your great grandfather had been shipped from Africa, you're fourth generation in the colonies, you speak English, all you've ever known is life on a farm here, plantation here, you're probably going to have less opportunity for freedom if you're born into, say, a colony in the French Caribbean, okay? In the French and the Spanish, owing to influence from the Catholic Church, are actually going to have encourage masters to free slaves under certain conditions. So if a slave, it serves you well for a period of time, it's not going to be uncommon in Spanish and French colonies to free the slave. In English colonies, it's not going to happen as much. All right, there's a couple different reasons for that, but it's not going to happen as much. Another thing that's not going to happen as much is there's simply not going to be as much ability to escape from slavery. For a variety of reasons, particularly geography, we'll see in places like Brazil, slaves will escape. They'll just run west into Amazon wooded areas, and they'll be able to live out the rest of their life in freedom. Owing to the geography here in North America, particularly these Appalachian Mountains, if you're a slave and you escape, there's a much better chance you're going to get caught. And also sort of deterring this chance to get your freedom is there's not going to be as much maroon communities, or rebellions are going to have less of a chance to be successful. So you'll occasionally see successful slave rebellions in Latin America. You don't see that up here, and this is probably having to do with the geography as well. So if you're born as a slave in the British colonies, things might be worse for you in a lot of ways, particularly gaining freedom. It's looked down upon in British colonies to free slaves, and there's less chance to earn your freedom. Having said that, and and taking into consideration that none of this is good, if you're born a slave in the British colonies, there is a better chance that you're going to survive and live longer. All right. Most slaves brought to the Caribbean, French colonies, Spanish colonies are going to be put to work on sugar plantations in tropical environments where the work is extremely difficult, more difficult than tobacco farming or rice farming. And it's going to be an environment where disease is going to be uh, prevalent. So, if you're working on a sugar plantation in a sweltering environment where malaria and yellow fever are common, very good chance you're going to die before reaching adulthood. You don't see many slaves worked to death, and you don't see nearly as much death due to disease in the British colonies. Couple reasons for this: just the fact that geography, disease isn't going to be as prevalent, although again it is fairly common in the South, but also because maybe the English are less likely to work their slaves to death because bringing slaves from Africa is more expensive. It's simply a longer journey, and they're going to cost more. So you don't want to work your slaves to death if it's going to cost more to replace them. The death rate in Brazil, for example, which is right across from Africa, is pretty atrocious. So again, not good, but if you're born a slave, probably less chance for freedom, but more chance you're going to survive into adulthood. There's also going to be in these colonies, in some ways, life will be worse for women. In other ways, life is going to be better for women. Okay? So, in England, women are regarded as, in British society as a whole, women are going to be regarded as inferior to men in a majority of respects, a lot of different respects. They're going to be seen as incapable or of dealing properly with politics and business in particular. They are not going to be able to vote because they're not seen as being able to participate in politics. And in a lot of areas of Britain and some of these British colonies in North America, it's going to be illegal for women to own businesses, and in some areas, illegal for them to own property at all. Okay, this is compared to Spain and Spanish colonies. Women can own property as much as they want. That's sort of an artifact from the Reconquista, where husbands are dying left and right, and sort of you have to have women to run the property. British society, that was never the case. So some of these British colonies, and the laws are going to differ from one colony to another. So General Court might establish its own rules. The Colonial Assembly of New York would establish its own rules. House of Burgesses might establish its own rules. But in most of these, if a woman and her husband dies, and the couple owns property, essentially the property cannot go to the woman, and it will be inherited by maybe their first male child or maybe his brother if there's no male child. The women, it's illegal for women to own property. Okay, so that's going to be something that women aren't going to have an opportunity to have that they can in other areas. Now, again, the politics thing, women aren't going to be allowed to participate in the government. As we talked about, a lot of these colonial assemblies have representative governments. Who can vote in these things is going to differ. Some are going to have property restrictions on voting. Some are going to have religious restrictions still on who could vote. We're going to talk about that in a second. But all of them are basically going to say women cannot participate in voting. They can't. They have no place in politics. That would be the same, though, you would see in Spanish and French colonies as well. All right. So in these ways, women's life in the English colonies are not as good or sort of equal to what you would see in other colonies. But in other ways, there are going to be at least some opportunities for women in these British colonies that you won't see in other areas of the world. One is that if you're born a woman in the British colonies, you're more likely to receive an education than if you were, say, born a woman in Europe or born a woman in Spanish colonies or French colonies. And this in particular goes to the Puritan founding of New England. There's a couple other factors there as well, but basically the Puritans said, you've got to educate all your children, teach them to speak to God, teach them how to read the Bible. This included women as well. So in the colonies, you're going to see this push towards education for both women or girls and boys. In general, though, the education is going to be different, especially after a certain point. Men after a certain point, or boys after a certain point, will learn sciences, will learn politics. Women will learn the arts. And this is going to be one of the ways that women in British society are going to have some opportunity you don't see at other places, because women will be taught things like how to play piano, how to write, poetry, literature, painting, this type of thing. And because of this, we're going to see some places in these colonies, you will have fairly famous and successful women artists, musicians, because that was seen in British society as one of the places where women sort of can excel. So for the most part, women are going to be viewed as caregivers, homemakers. But if you didn't want to do that, and you're one of the women that was received an education, which again is a higher percentage than you would see in other places in the world, you could potentially be an artist, something like that. And this is going to mean this isn't the only work opportunity for women. You will see some women that will be school teachers. That's another area in British society where women are going to be allowed opportunities outside of the home. Now, kind of making this interesting and sort of combining some of these unusual factors, the most famous poet in New England at the time was actually an enslaved woman named Phyllis Wheatley. She was a black woman who had been up here in New England. There wasn't nearly as many slaves as there are going to be down here, but there were some. But up here in New England, there's more likely to educate their slaves. Phyllis Wheatley was taught how to read and write, and then she started writing poetry, and she became this famous poet. So that's this sort of unusual juxtaposition you're going to have with sort of slavery and women in these English colonies. Another thing you're going to see that women can have in the English colonies that you won't see in, say, Spanish America or French America or most of Europe is there is going to be some opportunity for divorce. Now, it's not going to be the conditions are going to be much greater than you would have today. Today, more or less easy to get a divorce. But back then, if a woman wanted divorce, it's it's possible, although difficult. What you would generally have to do is you would have to petition the Colonial Assembly. So New Jersey, go to the New Jersey government and basically ask them for divorce. The Colonial Assembly would have to agree to grant the divorce, and usually they're only going to do it in cases of severe abuse or extreme conditions. So you can see that occasionally in British society, although it was rare, but it was more common than you're going to see in a lot of other areas of the world. So all this to say is that life, especially compared to today, not good for a slave, not good for a woman. But if you compare it to other areas of the world and enslaved people in other areas of the world, it's not as bad, at least in some regards, as other areas of the world. All right, so this is sort of makes life in general better in these colonies compared to other areas of the world at the time. Another thing you're going to see that's different in the colonies and other areas of the world is there's relative religious freedom. Okay? All right. So what we had talked about is Puritans coming over here to settle for religious reasons, to establish a city on a hill or to escape, to practice their own religion in peace. Down here in the South, these colonies had been settled primarily for monetary reasons, and because of this, there's not going to be a whole lot of religious restrictions. Some will have anti-Catholic restrictions, like you're only supposed to serve on the Colonial Assembly if you are a Protestant. But by the mid-1700s, a number of these religious restrictions had gone away in the South. They've gotten to the point where they say, all right, we don't care if you're what branch of Protestantism you are. A lot of them had said Catholicism's fine. As a matter of fact, in Maryland, a significant number of Catholics had moved to Maryland, and because they're sort of adjacent to these other southern colonies, it becomes less of an issue. If you have Catholic neighbors and they're fine, you're not worried as much about it. So we'd seen these southern states essentially lift these religious restrictions. Again, to compared to today, if you're a Catholic, you're probably going to get some sneers and some mistreatment, but nothing like you would see if you went to Spain and you were a Protestant, or went to England and maybe you were a Catholic there, although they were fairly tolerant by this point as well. Now there is going to be some continued religious persecution in some of these areas. Not Rhode Island, as we talked about. Religious tolerance had been ingrained in the government from the beginning with Roger Williams, but in these other Puritan colonies, you still had laws saying, if you're Catholic, you can come here, you can do business, you can even stay. The Puritanism had died out to the point where, if you're a different type of Protestantism, you can be here. But if you're Catholic, you would almost certainly, your neighbors aren't going to like you. You can't serve in government. So there is going to be some religious persecution. I don't want to portray it as this religious haven, but compared to other areas of the world, it's in general better off. All right, so relative religious freedom, and relative religious tolerance. Other reasons that life in these colonies is better for the most part than other areas of the world is disease is not as prevalent in these areas as you're going to see in, say, Europe, Africa, and Asia. Part of this is the fact that there's just a lot of space between people. Again, forcing Indians west, a lot of open land, agricultural. Whereas England, there's a dense population, people pack close together. Doesn't have to go far from disease to pass from one person to the next. That's not going to be the case here in these colonies because most people are going to live far from one another, and there's not very many big cities by 1763. Boston's more than 5,000 people. New York, Philadelphia, maybe Charleston. And you will see these outbreaks of disease in those regions. You'll see, cholera epidemics arrive and typhoid, and then you basically have to stop things down and have quarantines there. But in the countryside, it's not going to matter much because a lot of times you're going to go days, weeks, months on end without even seeing your neighbor, so disease isn't going to spread very easily. Now you are going to have yellow fever, malaria, these types of diseases are going to be prevalent in these southern colonies. Up in these northern areas, yellow fever is never going to reach up here. Malaria will reach only occasionally in hot areas. So disease is more prevalent down here, but it's not going to be a major thing. Now, I shouldn't say it is going to be a major thing, but compared to tropical areas of the world, it's not going to be as bad as that. Bacterial infections are not going to be as prevalent in the English Americas for a couple reasons. Now, one thing that had begun to happen is the British had started to import this beverage, this tea from India. You would bring these leaves from this British colony in India. They would import it to the colonies. Tea has caffeine in it, so what a lot of these colonists would do is caffeine's a great drug that everybody enjoys if they get hooked on it. And what they would do is import this for fairly cheap. And in order to extract the caffeine, you got to heat tea up. So sort of unknowingly, they're killing the bacteria when they heat the tea up. So this popular beverage is basically, the most popular non-water beverage in the colonies is going to be something that's also antibacterial. Not only that, but there's alcohol is incredibly popular. You can't pass bacterial infections for alcohol, although obviously alcohol comes with its own problems. But alcohol, again, you're not going to get microbes passing with that because it can't survive in it. So people in these areas of the colonies, alcohol would be popular, and that might be a reason for the reduction of disease. Another reason why life in the colonies is probably better than other places in the world, and again, this may owe to the abundance of land, is the fact that people in these colonies are going to get more calories per person than most areas of the world. And again, this comes from if you have more places to plant crops and trees, you're going to produce more wheat, apples, whatever, and this is going to allow people to eat better than they would in, say, Britain. Not only that, being located on the coast, this means there's a lot of fish, and so you're going to have people that, compared to today, wouldn't be a great diet. And a lot of people, you're only going to have 2 or 3 staple crops you eat, and then maybe a couple different types of meat you eat on a regular basis. But compared to other agricultural places in the world, things are going to be better off, and people are going to eat better than other areas of the world. So all of these things together means that if you were born into these colonies, especially right at 1763, you're thinking things are pretty good, because you don't have to worry about a foreign threat. Indian threat's been reduced, especially on the coast where most people live. Disease isn't as prevalent as it is in other places in the world. Your diet's better than most places in the world. There's more opportunity, economic opportunity, because there's more land available. Higher literacy rates. You have a better chance of receiving an education. Again, obviously, if you're a slave, compared especially to today, things aren't going to be good. But there is more chance that you're going to live a full life. Again, less chance you're going to get freedom. But if you're a woman in these colonies, again, more chance of an education, some opportunities for employment. Not when compared to today, but again, compared to other areas of the world, you might be better off. So most colonists are going to recognize this, and especially after the end of the 7 Years' War, they understand that they have things better than most people. Not only that, but these colonists in 1763, they're really going to appreciate the fact that Britain leaves them alone. For the most part, Britain is staying out of colonial affairs, and it had stayed out of colonial affairs since the first colonies had been founded. Now, we've talked about this a little bit before, but the way that Britain would operate its colonies is the king would approve a colony being set up. First, it's the Virginia Company, and basically the king said, Virginia Company, you come in here, you deal with the colony, you make the rules for the colony. I'll take a little bit of money out from the colony. We'll talk about that more in a second. But you handle the day-to-day matters. You set up the judicial system, you make the laws. Virginia Company had set up the House of Burgesses, which was a representative body of the people, and they basically made the day-to-day decisions in the colonies. Again, when the Puritans came over, they set up the General Court in Massachusetts, and we'd seen, as the king had granted all 13 of these colonies their own colonial charters, they had all set up their own individual government. So most colonies are going to be run by these colonial assemblies or local governments. So as colonies expand, you see these new towns set up, and the new towns, a lot of times they would appoint judges, to try property disputes, things like that. But the person that is governing you is usually right by you, whether that be the town mayor next to you or, just a couple miles down the road, the Colonial Assembly. The British government is going to have a tiny bit of interference in colonial affairs, but it's very little. So what the king had done after granting these colonial charters and these colonial governments had been set up is he had sent royal governors to oversee the colonial assemblies. So at one point the king had put a royal governor over the general court, and we had talked about 1624, the governor had taken over the House of Burgesses. And what these governors were supposed to do is basically make sure the king's interests are represented, and if Parliament says something, the governor tries to make sure it is carried out in the colonies. But almost to a T, what each governor found out was that, hey, it's so much easier if I just let these guys make the day-to-day decisions. So the governors came over, took a seat at the House of Burgesses, or the General Court, General Assembly, whatever each of these colonial assemblies is called, and basically they would just sit down, play Candy Crush, do whatever, while the colonists made the decisions themselves. So these colonial assemblies are making the decisions, and in all these colonial assemblies, although it differs, how the colonial assemblies are chosen, they're made up by the people. Okay, so in Virginia, it's men that own property, elite status, can be elected to the House of Burgesses. I don't know how North Carolina does theirs, but I imagine it's a similar thing. Everybody, maybe it's an informal vote, or maybe it's they actually have a hand ballot vote, but they would vote for their colonial officials. They would meet up and they would make the decisions for North Carolina. Same thing for South Carolina, Georgia. So if you're going to have to be governed, at least you're governed locally and you're going to be governed in some form of representative government, which again is better than most places in the world. If you're in Britain, parliament's only the elites are choosing it, and again, these landed wealthy individuals that have been there for a long time. You have almost no say in who serves in the government in Spain and France because they have absolute monarchs. But in these colonies, again, the colonial assemblies are going to rule themselves for the most part. And as a matter of fact, there's going to be a term that historians use for how the British are going to deal with its colonies. Some people, historians, refer to this treatment as salutary neglect. Basically, Britain's going to adopt this approach that as long as the colonists, pay duties, and we're going to talk about those in a second, and don't cause trouble and remain loyal, they can do whatever they want. They're going to govern themselves. So we'll see in the colonies, these colonial assemblies, they're going to make the day-to-day decisions, and the governor's going to sit up there. Occasionally he'll speak up, but for the most part, he's going to sit back and let these guys handle matters. Really, I want you to think about the various colonial governments as run by these governors who don't really care one way or another. Very representative. And the colonial assemblies are going to be the ones that appoint judges. They're going to have fair court systems, different from one colony to another, but they're going to say this is how we're going to handle land disputes, things like that. Colonial assemblies, these are also going to be the ones that handle Indian matters. So during the colonial period, if you did have a tribe attack, basically what would happen is the colonial assembly would call up the militia, and then they would sometimes ask the British governor, hey, can you send some redcoats to support us? And they're going to be the ones to push the Indians out and then, sign over the land. So they're dealing with Indian matters. And the big thing about these colonial assemblies is they're the only ones that are taxing in the colonies. So when I say tax, I mean, think about how we're taxed today. If how does the state government, local government, and national government tax? If you're talking about the national government, they're basically taking income tax. Every time you get a paycheck, you're going to see a percentage go to the United States government for soldiers, to pay for new buildings, to pay for national museum, national parks, that type of thing. That's taken out whenever we get a paycheck. State governments take it out in different ways. Here in Texas, they're going to take out a sales tax. So every time you buy a candy bar, you got to pay 7-8 cents to the state of Texas, and property tax. So if you own a house, every year you have to pay property tax based on whatever the value of your home is worth. So that's how the state tax, local taxes, sales tax. If you buy a candy bar, 1 cent goes to the government of wherever, Dallas or something like that. And then Dallas will take that 1 cent and use it for schools, things like that. During the colonial times, at least prior to 1763, the only people taking taxes to do stuff, things locally, were the colonial assemblies. So let's say Virginia decides they want to open public schools throughout. Maybe this is going to be done at the local level. Maybe the city here will say we need schools, and they're going to, have their own local tax. Maybe they start taxing honey or something like that. Every time honey's sold, we're going to collect a 1 cent tax, and then that would be used to pay the public schools. But maybe it's something bigger. Like maybe they would decide we need a road between the East Coast and then these Appalachian Mountains, and this road's going to cost a lot of money to hire people to clear this stuff out. Well, the Colonial Assembly, again, these representative groups in Virginia would be the House of Burgesses. They would be the one to collect the tax from the citizens. How they're going to do it's varied. They might have a property tax like we do today. Everybody has to pay a percentage of whatever their property is worth. They might do it as a sales tax, so whenever certain type of products sold, the Colonial Assembly collects some money, and then they'll use this money to build the road. The only person collecting, or only group in collecting tax internally, are local governments in the Colonial Assembly. The British government does not collect money internally, okay? This is something that's going to have to be cleared. The British government lets this handle, the colonial assemblies handle it. And again, the colonial assemblies are representative governments, so the people accept the taxes because they're choosing who serves on these colonial assemblies. As a matter of fact, prior to 1763, the only way Britain gets money from its colonies is in the form of duties, okay? A duty is not the same thing as a tax. What a duty is it's going to be money collected from items imported to the colonies, so from overseas into the colonies, or from items leaving the colonies. So the only way the British are going to give money to pay for British redcoats or pay for the King's New Coat or whatever is when ships arrive in these docks on the colonies. So you're going to have these major ports in the colonies. You'll have Charleston's a big one. You're going to have a couple in Virginia, a couple in North Carolina. Big ones, Boston and Massachusetts, Philadelphia, and New York. Whenever goods come in from Britain, what will happen is when the ship pulls up, there'll be a duty collector sitting at the end of the dock. He's a guy with a clipboard, and basically he's going to say, what are you offloading? Okay, I'm bringing 20 shirts from Britain, and basically this guy's going to say, all right, well, these shirts are going to sell for $10. There's a 10% duty on them. Give me $1 a shirt, so $10 or whatever. That $10 is going to go to the British government. Same thing if tobacco farmer is sending his stuff to market. He's going to basically have the tobacco bales brought to the dock. When it's being loaded onto a ship, the duty collector is going to sit here and collect, count up how much tobacco is leaving, and he's going to take a percentage for the British government. And then they'll bring everything they collect during the day to these customs houses, and eventually, you know, they're going to send the money back to the king and Parliament to figure out what to do with it. This is the only way the British government gets money from the colonists. Again, local governments get money other ways, but the only way the British get money is these import and export duties. Now, here's the thing with this. Couple things with this. A duty's not the same thing as a tax. Tax is done internally. Duties are just collected on import and export duties, all right? Now, a couple things with this. There are some restrictions on the way that Britain is going to collect these duties. One thing they're going to do is they want the colonists to, they're going to put in place some measures, and the colonists are going to not like these measures. We'll talk about them more in a little bit here. But basically, to discourage the colonists from trading with anybody else but Britain, they're going to make sure the colonies, before they can ship to, say, France, or bring goods in from France or French islands or Spanish islands or Dutch or whoever, they're going to want the goods to go back to Britain, and where they'll be collecting a duty in Britain before they'll go to the colonies. And the same thing with goods leaving the colonies. Let's say you're in North Carolina, you want to sell tobacco to France. Before you can do that, you have to go to Britain, meet a duty collector there. So you're getting a duty collected as you're leaving North Carolina, as you get to the docks in Britain, and then as you're leaving for France, you might even get a duty collected a third time. And then by the time you get to France, you've already had a significant chunk of your profit taken out by these various duties. The British do this intentionally and don't just let you trade directly between North Carolina and France, because they would rather the people in North Carolina trade directly with Britain. So they basically add this extra step in, and it's going to increase the distance in trading, because they don't want their colonies trading with Britain, France, Spain, or anybody else besides Britain. So they do this intentionally to encourage the colonies to trade with the mother country. So that's one thing. And again, this can be a big hassle, because let's say a French sugar islands down here, really good about producing sugar, produce it much cheaper than British sugar islands. If you want sugar in North Carolina, you can't just bring it in directly from a French island. You basically have to have this ship go all the way back to Britain, adding thousands and thousands of extra miles on the voyage, have additional duty collected, and then travel another thousands of miles back to North Carolina. By the time you get back to North Carolina, after the additional transportation costs and duties are collected, sugar is going to be much more expensive than it would have been if they had just been able to ship it right from the Caribbean. So Britain wants stuff coming from foreign countries or going to foreign countries to stop at home first. Another restriction Britain is going to put on these duties is anything manufactured leaving the colonies is going to have a higher duty than raw goods. So if it's tobacco leaving North Carolina, Virginia, duty is, I'm making up these numbers, 10%. So you just pay a small percentage of duty. But if it's somebody has taken that tobacco, turned it into a finished product like cigars, you may pay a 20% duty. Why would Britain do that? Why would it increase the duties for finished goods? Well, the British want the manufacturing to be done at home. They want the sort of the manufacturing hub to be back in Britain where the government can monitor it better. And because, by the way, a lot of parliament's actually involved in manufacturing, they don't want the colonists to manufacture themselves. They sort of want the colonies to be producers of raw goods, and they sell them back to Britain. The British turn them into finished goods, and then they can sell their finished goods back to the colonies for a substantial profit. If the colonies are producing their own manufactured goods, they're not buying from the home country, and the merchants and the businessmen and the wealthy in Britain don't like that. So the only way the British get money out of the colonists is a form of duties going into and out of official docks. They do have restrictions on foreign trade. You got to go back to Britain first, and they are going to have higher duties on manufactured goods. But for the most part, this isn't going to be that restrictive. And as a matter of fact, most colonists don't even understand the duties. Most colonists are subsistence farmers. They're not even really buying anything from anybody else anyway. They're just making everything they eat, making their own clothes. Only the wealthy are really the ones that are affected by this. So if you're somebody who's wealthy and you're shipping tobacco to this dock, you're producing a surplus, which is not most citizens. Most are just making enough to get along and maybe trade with a neighbor for goods. So only the very wealthy are the ones that are actually seeing these import duties taken out, import and export duties, and they're the only ones that can afford to buy goods from England anyway. So the vast majority of colonists don't see this anyway, and if they do see it, the duties have already been taken out by the time it hits the market. So a lot of people like this approach from Britain because they don't see it. Others who do see it, they don't particularly like it. But the thing with these duties is the colonists are going to figure out various ways to get around them. So let's say that you are somebody who wants to ship tobacco to Britain or wants to buy something from Britain, but you don't want to pay import and export duties. How can you do it? Well, what colonists will start to do or figure out that they can do is they can bribe duty collectors. So the guy sitting here at the dock with a clipboard, he doesn't make a lot of money. What if I pay him, £10 or something, get him to overlook a lot of the tobacco I'm about to ship out? Have 500 pounds. Hey, just say I have 200 pounds. Just collect 200 or 200 pounds of tobacco, 200 bales or whatever. Just count that. Ignore the 300 other bales, and I'll pay you a little bit of the difference. I'll pay less duties in total. I'll ship this stuff out. My profits won't be cut into as much, and you're going to be slipping a little bit of money under the table. So we would see these colonists bribe duty collectors if they didn't want to pay a duty. We'll also see these colonists smuggle. We have Han Solo in Star Wars. He was a smuggler. People think of smugglers like drug smugglers because things are illegal. That's what Han Solo did, by the way. But spice or whatever it was in Star Wars. But a good chunk of smugglers are avoiding trade restrictions or are avoiding duties. That's what would happen in these colonies. So if these ports have duties collectors in them, like the major ports, there's going to be where these docks are, then pull somewhere that doesn't have a dock and a duty collector. Find a harbor and offload your ship, offload the goods there, and then bring them to market, by a horse and buggy. Now, it's nice having a dock because it's easier to offload stuff. You have all the infrastructure you can work with. But if the duties are so high, just do it this way. It's going to be a little bit more work to offload it, but the work might be justified if you want to avoid these duties. Now, the problem with this is that if you're caught doing this, the British could seize your ship, throw you in jail. But the thing is, before 1763, the British didn't devote many ships to catching these smugglers. And as a matter of fact, the British understood that there was a little bit of smuggling going on. They understood that Americans would occasionally smuggle. They understood that they would bribe duty collectors occasionally. But again, the British are practicing the salutary neglect where they sort of overlook minor things because prior to 1763, these guys are behaving themselves. For the most part, they're paying their duties, and things aren't. There's not a major issue with the colonists. As a matter of fact, 1763, the British are pretty happy with their colonists. The colonists are very happy with the British. As a matter of fact, the king who had led the British during the 7 Years' War was a guy named King George III. The Americans love being under King George III. They liked the relationship they had with Britain, where they handled day-to-day matters. Their colonial assemblies do. The British don't really tax, or they don't tax them. They don't. They collect duties, but there are ways to get around those duties. And again, the British are doing them favors by helping them defeat the French. So in 1763, right after the 7 Years' War, these colonists, basically to recognize how great they have it, they're going to put up a bunch of statues to King George throughout the colonies. Thank you for handling the colonies these ways. Thank you for defeating the French. And in 1763, the colonists basically recognized that they have things better off than anywhere else in the world, which is going to be interesting because 1763 they put these statues up. By 1776, a lot of these statues are going to be coming down. We'll talk about why that's the case later.